Good morning. Today is Wednesday, April 6th, 2022. It's 8:32 a.m. and this is a meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We're resuming our work on H715, an act relating to the clean heat standard. And I'd like to go directly to our first guest of the morning, Beverly Little Thunder. And I see your tile up on the screen. If you can provide testimony with or without video, sometimes people have a poor connection, but you want to.
I have a good connection. Just give me 1 second, please. I'm actually not even in Vermont. I'm in Washington, D.C. right now at the moment.
Well, hopefully, if you're in the big city, you have a great connection. Okay, so good morning. Thank you for joining. As you know, we have H715 in front of us. We're taking testimony starting last week, and we're still gathering information. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the bill, what you would like the committee to keep in mind as we work our way through it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate very much you giving me this time to give you my thoughts. I've been following this bill for a while, and it concerns me greatly. It concerns me primarily because the only thing that I am seeing being considered is the economics of the bill. I don't really see any thought being given to the people that it's going to affect. It would appear to me that the people that are going to benefit from the most are probably the people who can least afford to be affected by it. And I question when it says clean heat, because although I keep hearing the word biofuels tossed around, I am aware that biofuels are utilizing other fuels that are being made out of corn, primarily, that is being grown for biofuels, but it's also destroying a valuable place for carbon to be stored. And while all of that is, the scientific aspect of it, I have to think about what I've heard, growing up. And as a Native woman, our views on things are really, really different. We are much concerned with all living things, and that includes the plants, the animals, the dirt, the water. All of those are living entities. And I don't see anything that refers to decreasing our consumption, to not using as much energy as being used. It doesn't matter how many kilowatts of electricity are generated by biofuels, it is still up to us to decrease our consumption. And I feel like we need to begin maybe sinking money into convincing people to decrease what they use, to realize that we don't have an indispensable supply of fossil fuels even to continue utilizing energy the way that we do. I was on the subcommittee for just transitions, and there were a lot of work done over the last year on generating, the guiding principles and considering the people's very, very least amount of means that were going to be affected by a transition in our energy development and the things that we did. I mean, even using solar, it still is taking from the earth to create some of the equipment needed to generate that solar energy. Meanwhile, there are people in Burlington who don't know today whether or not they're going to have electricity tomorrow. And some of the electricity is vital. Some of it is required to run medical equipment. It's really, really important that we look at the bills that we pass today, because these are the bills that are going to affect the future of my grandchildren, your grandchildren, and their children. This isn't about us today. The decisions that we make today may affect us for a few years, but ultimately they're going to affect those future generations that are yet to come. There are so many red flags are raised for me when I read this bill. And I guess I am appalled by the usage of language. Language can be very, very powerful. As a Lakota woman, I know how powerful language can be used because it was taken from my people and it's affected our culture tremendously. And in the English language, it's the same. There are a lot of words that are tossed around that the average person does not understand what that means. And, for instance, the common person hears biofuels and clean heat and clean energy, and they think, oh, well, scientists somewhere must have figured out how to create something that is not going to be harmful to the human being or to life on this planet as a whole, when that couldn't be further from the truth. And so I urge you, as you're considering this bill, to really, really think hard about what is it that we are passing, and you get the input of the people that is going to affect. To have town halls, to go to the places where some of our new Americans gather, to go to some of the tribal offices and talk to the people that are most going to be affected economically. There are many people in our state that economics and saving a dime doesn't really matter. But for someone whose dime is going to feed their family for a week, it makes a lot of difference. And when we talk about weatherization, tossing $3,000 at a house that needs $10,000 worth of work is not going to suffice, because most times those people do not have the additional $8,000 or $9,000 that are going to be needed to complete the work. And so it really is pointless. And those are the things that, run through my mind as someone who does not live on the very edge of society. I have been there. And today I don't live that way. I've learned to do my own food. I've learned how to put up my own food. I've learned how to live much more in harmony with the earth that I live on, because I'm here to take care of it, not destroy it. And to, quote so many of my grandparents and aunts and uncles, they didn't listen. They haven't listened. And I'm asking you today, are you listening? Are you really, really listening? Or are we just passing a bill because there's big corporations behind this bill that really are looking to make more of a profit? So thank you. I thank you so much for giving me the time to voice what I am feeling. I'm not highly educated, and I don't know how always to put words into what I want to say. But believe me, what I say today comes from my heart. Doshka.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. I think we have a few questions. Senator McDonald?
You have shared with us the things that you are worried about. And we're here representing average persons, but we've learned enough to try and craft a bill that sequesters carbon without doing more harm than good. Do you have any suggestions on how to answer the questions that you've just asked us some questions? Do you have any suggested answers on how to deal with biofuels, for example? What should we do?
I think that, you know, at the very basis of all of that is to start putting energy and money, I mean physical energy, verbal energy, how we feel, into convincing people that they do not have to use as much energy as they're using, that we need to cut consumption. Answer is not to develop more and more fuels. It is to decrease consumption and to learn how to live within our means. Learn how to live on a planet that we're doing a really good job of destroying. We're doing a really good job of killing our Mother Earth.
The reason we have a bill before us is a general acknowledgement and realization that we are, for lack of better words, destroying our planet slowly. Do you have any? The people who sell and make a living by selling fossil fuels will have some very specific things to say about this bill. Do you have any suggestions on what we should do in this bill that we have not yet committed to doing?
I know that there are going to be many people who create, biomass. There are many companies who will benefit greatly off the backs of those who can least afford to give it. They do not want to hear how people increase their usage. They do not want to hear that. They don't want to lose their profits. And when are we going to put people over profits? When are we going to put the lives of our grandchildren ahead of what the end line of profit for a company at the end of the year is? We put more emphasis on how much money we are making from something than how long the planet is going to be able to sustain life.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for your testimony. Any further committee questions? Senator McCormick.
Just a comment. This is reminding me of a couple of weeks ago, we were dealing with bills having to do with hunting and trapping. And people who did not like those bills didn't actually speak a lot about the bills. They spoke about how important it is to respect Vermonters' traditions. We've had other issues where people come and talk about the importance of obeying the Constitution. And I never needed to be convinced of the importance of respecting Vermonters' traditions. I wanted the discussion of the bill. I never had to be convinced of the importance of obeying the Constitution. I was willing to entertain a conversation about whether or not a bill was actually unconstitutional, but I didn't need to be told to honor the Constitution. So too here. I think what you said was eloquent and right, but I think everyone on this committee knows it. It's why we're doing the bill. Now, if the bill we're doing isn't achieving what we need to achieve, we really do need to know, to get an analysis of the bill and where is the bill falling short. Now, the one thing I take that is that it doesn't pay enough attention to conservation, and to reduce energy use. Am I correct? That is okay. That is what I'm taking out of your testimony that I'm going to be able to use. Otherwise, everything else you said is why I'm here in the first place.
Well, I understand that. And as I said, I don't have the language to convey the seriousness of what I see in this bill. And I understand that your job is to determine whether or not this bill is going to achieve what is being written to do. What I'm asking you is to really look at all the little tiny nooks and crannies that this bill is putting forth behind words and ideas that have not been proven and that have been proven to do harm otherwise, and to ask you not to continue that harm, not to be a part, even a small part, of passing a bill that's going to create that harm. Because each one of us has a responsibility. Whether we sit in the State House or whether we're sitting at home sticking seeds in the ground, as I'm hoping to do here soon.
Right. Well,
Thank you.
again, thank you. And to your point, for us, the other side of this bill is continuing with business as usual. And the current paradigm is, we know, highly damaging. We burn tremendous amount of fuel, fossil fuel, every day. So the goal of the bill is to reduce that. Now, I don't know to what degree exactly if people, there are two threads in there. One is using less fossil fuel to reduce those damages. The other is helping people. There's a weatherization bill that goes hand in glove with this bill, so that homes will require less energy to begin with. And so this bill is, it's not the whole picture of what we're trying to work on. And so I say that just to be, we're in tune with what you're saying. We're looking to change the system we currently have, which is not well equipped to deal with fossil fuel use right now for how we heat our homes. So thank you very much again for joining us.
I ask you to think about the substandard housing down in the north end of Burlington and how weatherization is going to help those people heat their homes.
Sure.
Because most of those landlords are not going to take advantage of a incentive to bring those homes up to a point where they can be heated in a more effective manner, and those people can least afford to continue living.
So for people, so the low income weatherization program is So it's, again, not part of this bill, but.
I understand.
Is scheduled to receive in the current budget $80 million, which is on top of its usual funding. And they've also made a decision in when they do that work, that if there are other fixes that have to be made, like for instance, if someone has a leaky roof, they don't want to come in and insulate because it would be silly to do that. The insulation will get ruined. The house isn't really fit for living, right? They used to have to decline to do those projects because they didn't have money to do fixes not related to insulating the place. But now they are switching, they, in the last 6 months or so, switched over to what they're calling a no deferrals program. They're not going to put off weatherization work on a house because it also needs a fix to the roof, for instance. And they're boosting the budget that does that kind of fix. So we're hoping, well, not just hoping, we will do better on helping more people get safe, healthy housing. Will it be enough? I don't know. So, okay. Well, again, thanks for joining us. And
Thank you.
with that, we'd like to go to our next guest, Judy Dow. Ms. Dow, good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you again. We saw you, feels like a very long time ago when we were taking up the environmental justice bill.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yes, I do remember that. I want to thank you all for inviting me to speak today. And I'd like to tag on to what Beverly said with a little bit of history of the last 18 months or so, and tell you about myself first. I have degrees in education, Native studies, and a master's in teaching for social justice. My family has been here in Chittenden County for a documented 15 generations. I've been teaching traditional ecological knowledge for over 35 years. And I want to apologize in advance if I say something that might be offensive or shocking. My filter is broken after 1.5 years of serving on the Agriculture and Ecosystems Committee and the Bio Task Force Committee. I've seen more lies. Excuse me?
So those, just to make sure that everyone in the committee and anyone watching knows, you are part of those subcommittees as part of the Vermont Climate Council, correct? In developing
Correct.
the climate action plan? Okay.
Correct.
Thanks.
I've seen more lies, blatant deceit, political manipulation, and lack of understanding for Indigenous science during this time than I've ever cared to see. So much so that I now completely understand what my ancestors have gone through for over the last 400 years. Colonization is rough. First, I would like to tell you that the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee did not agree on biomass as a recommendation because we did not have sufficient time to research this topic. In addition, the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee expertise wasn't consulted by the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee in crafting of the white paper nor the bill. We, the committee, has often been told something is too technical or mathematical, and we don't have the expertise to participate in the creation of something. Many on this committee work with and on the land daily. We have relationships with the land that those in offices do not. So now I have so many questions. Why is the Climate Council only interested in their silos of knowledge? Why don't they want to braid together traditional ecological knowledge and Western science? I often ask myself this question. Is it because they don't want to hear our answers and want to silence our voices? Or is it because they want only one answer, that of the agency? I can't help but wonder, and I often ask these questions. Scientific consensus is that global warming results from an atmospheric buildup of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide. Of the carbon dioxide that we humans contribute, Roughly 2/3 is from the burning of fossil fuels, and 1/3 is from the burning of biomass, such as forests, grasslands, and agricultural crops. We understand that forestry is a part of the industrial agriculture taking over this country and contributing to biomass power plants, the next biggest carbon polluter over coal. We just didn't have the time to research and put together a recommendation. The time schedule was too short. I would like you to know that according to ANR's own calculations, McNeil Generating Plant annually emits 503,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide and over 10,000 metric tons of nitrous oxide and methane. Here's a helpful comparison. According to the US Environmental Protection Agency, one of their calculators indicates the amount of CO2 emitted by McNeil every year is the same amount of CO2 sequestered by forest of 595,268 acres in 1 year. This is more than the total sequestered carbon annually from the entire Green Mountain Forest, which is only about 400,000 acres. Reigate is not far behind the figures of McNeil. Please don't fall into the same trap Ag and Ecosystem did by not asking proper questions. It's a learning curve, I understand. You must take the time to learn and not make the same mistakes we did. Question authority. You guys are of the same age as me, and that bumper sticker was something we all had on our cars in the 70s. It's important to our children and our grandchildren. The agencies of Vermont have one mind way of thinking and are not easily accepting of other opinions. This way of thinking is not good. McNeil was built in a floodplain on top of the most highly sensitive archaeological site in the state. At least 23 state archaeological reports have confirmed this. The Division of Historical Preservation and I created the Burlington Intervale Archaeological District and placed it on the State Register of Historical Places. This land is protected by placing the 1,700-acre interval the McNeil is located on in the state historical archaeological site list. And any continued building or expansion would be difficult and certainly not equitable to the burial sites in this area or the people living above the smokestacks on the hill. These people are often ill, so much so that Senator Leahy had a community medical center built right in their neighborhood. The Burlington Intervale is a pasana, a bowl of food for the Abenaki people, never once traded or sold because it was so important to the people's survival. To McNeil, it's a place to be surrounded by a man-made 4-foot berm and a barbed wire fence to block off the natural flow of water and animals while interrupting an ecosystem that has been in place for over 10,000 years. We must look at equity for all, including the land and the water. I pray for you to understand this, because if our water and soil are not healthy, we will not be healthy either. Let's talk about equity. The Global Warming Solution Act clearly stated there should be discussion about equity at every step of the process. Halfway through the process, I was suggesting a lack of equity at every step, pointing out this was not a box to be checked off, but rather something to be discussed regularly. I suggested 4 sustainable questions to be placed in the guiding principles, and that economy not be the primary thing to be considered, but rather placing the land in the forefront and economy next. I believe these questions will be helpful for you to consider as well. 1, does the practice support reducing energy? 2, can the practice contribute to lessening man-made waste? 3, does the practice reduce destruction of the natural environment? 4, is there fairness to all living things, human and non-human? That would give equity to water and soil. My suggestions were considered and added to the guiding principles. This then gave equity to land and water as a non-living thing. Then the guiding principles were ignored. Economy always came first over equity to the land, water, and the people that cared for them. This happened every time. Kyle Morris was hired to make an equity assessment tool for the subcommittees. We received this tool just a week before our final reports were to be finished. Every committee I've spoken with has said in writing their reports that they had no time to use the tool. Equity was not considered in writing the report. Please don't think it was. Equity is not a box to be checked off by folks that casually talk about it without any understanding of what equity truly is. My concern continued with the lack of asking for reductions in S715. Instead of working to meet demands, let's reduce. People no longer understand the difference between a want and a need. You can provide them with all of the electricity and fuels they want with this so-called clean energy and fuel. But if they don't reduce their use, their wants will only continue to grow. Folks need to reduce their consumption and be given some education around the difference between a want and a need. That can happen. You can make that happen. I would suggest an incentive for simply turning down the thermostat down 10 degrees, put on a sweater. Everyone knows our winters are so much milder now. Skiers complain about it all the time. So button up and turn the dial down. And let's talk about electricity. I've been told by Jared Duvall that the increased need for electricity will come from Hydro-Quebec. I've heard you say we need to talk more often about local issues, not international issues. Boundaries are arbitrary when we are talking about climate change. This is a perfect example of why we should look at the impacts our state is having on the world and the world is having on us. Just so you know, 11 indigenous nations have already been relocated and has had over 3.8 million acres of land taken from them and then flooded by Hydro-Quebec to provide electricity for their neighbors to the south. Mercury found its way into the food chain because of its release from the flooding waters. These indigenous people now pay $17 for a liter bottle of drinking water and have lost their traditional fishing and hunting grounds. Please tell me, how is this equitable? If you can find balance in your heart and your mind, you know it is not equitable. Think of biodiversity that has been lost forever, the very biodiversity that would store carbon. Think about what you actually need. In addition to meet our future needs, Hydro-Quebec wants the land from 5 additional indigenous nations. This is not only inequitable, but breaking yet another treaty and making Hydro-Quebec not a renewable energy at all, unless they plan on taking more indigenous lands every time the want is there. This is not clean energy. This is rape. So please, no false climate solutions. Instead, ask questions and find answers. The true answers will help you to find the true solutions. This will take time. Don't rush it. That back box has sides just waiting for you to jump out of. Again, thank you for listening to my words. Now, please don't dismiss them in your haste to pass this bill. Take your time, do it right. Listen to all the voices, do your research, and remember this earth is your mother. Think forward, place yourself in the middle of 7 generations. Think forward 3 generations and backwards 3 generations. Your words and action will be seen and heard by those generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dow. Senator Campion.
Thank you, Ms. Dow. It's nice to see you again. You were very helpful to our committee education on the mascot bill. And so thanks for being here. Would you tell me what you're hoping to see us change in this bill at this point? And I'm sorry if I missed it. What is it that sounds like you feel like we're going down one path. If you could just briefly describe the path that you would prefer us to go down. Is it completely one of efficiency, conservation?
Well, first of all, you have to remember that conservationists come from the same people who were eugenicists back in the 1930s. So I think the path I want you to take is to educate yourself that around some of the things agency people say are green energy, are clean fuel, clean energy. They're not. We cannot go down the path of solar panels until we have a plan to recycle the lithium in those batteries. What are you going to do with them if we get a hurricane? A lot of them break.
I see. That's
You don't
so,
have, you're taking technology without solutions to how to deal with that. And as Beverly said, the most important thing to me is we have to start reducing. People have to know the difference between a want and a need, or they're always going to want.
thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Any other committee questions? I have a couple. So I'm not well versed in exactly what Hydro-Quebec's plans are. I was under the impression from a conversation with people from Hydro-Quebec maybe 4 or 5 years ago that their expansion was over. But it sounds like you're saying they're considering expanding their more new projects so they can generate more power. Do you know what the status is there?
Yes, they want to move into Newfoundland, expand the dam. You can just Google it and the information will be there.
Yeah, I'm slightly at a loss because there's a lot to sort of take in and examine the bill. In terms of what we'll be doing from here to when the bill leaves the committee, I think is taking concerns that you are raising, other people are raising. We'll be hearing later this morning a response to there's been a group of folks meeting informally, trying to gather all the concerns and see if they can come up with language that addresses them. So around the notion of biofuels, there's an expression clean coal. And I think a lot of people hear that with a certain amount of well-founded skepticism. So we are not interested in greenwashing. We're interested in, when we talk about clean energy, really doing our very best to make that real. And so we'll be looking more closely at like the biofuels definition. I know that Chair Briglin, when he introduced the bill in committee, said he felt like the sustainability provisions could use more specificity because they were general enough to not necessarily be helpful in guiding anything that would happen under the bill. So we're not done yet, and we appreciate your highlighting the perspective you bring to it. I do have one naive question. I've heard that 7 generations expression many times and never quite knew where it came from. Someone suggested to me that it was when you're at your youngest, you might have great grandparents. So you can be looking forward or hearing from people 3 generations ahead. By the time you're a great grandparent, you can have a great grandchild who's 3 generations behind. So that's like the maximum sort of living span of your life. Is that where that comes from?
Most Indigenous people have a version of the 7 generations or 2 versions of the 7 generations. Personally, I like to place myself in the middle. I like to know that my actions and words will be heard by those yet unborn and by those that have passed on before me. I feel strength in my actions and words coming from those who came before me. And I feel hope for those yet unborn by placing myself in the middle.
Well, thank you very much. Senator McCormick.
Just very briefly, John Quincy Adams said, think of your ancestry, think of your posterity. See yourself as a particular point. Said what?
All right. So thank you, Ms. Dow.
Can I just say one more thing, please?
Yeah.
I think it's very important. I have felt throughout this process that traditional ecological knowledge has been dismissed. As you go forward, I think it's very important to braid all knowledges together, to braid traditional ecological knowledge and Western science together, because many of the scientists you listen to are concerned about their silo of information, whether it's a forester or an environmentalist. They're concerned about their silo. And we have to braid all of this together to get a clear picture of how we should move forward. Thank you.
Okay. Well,
Thank
so just to help me understand that more deeply, who would, so the traditional, not traditional, the sort of agency-based ecological knowledge, we hear from ANR, foresters, etc. Who would we hear from to hear to learn more about traditional ecological knowledge?
I gave a PowerPoint to Ag and Ecosystems Committee on what traditional ecological knowledge is. I'd be happy to share that with you.
Okay, that would be great. And could you also, because you did have members in your testimony today that I couldn't quite capture and listen at the same time, would you be willing to send your testimony to our committee assistant, Judith Newman, please?
Yes.
Great, that way could we read it, and that would be helpful.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to go to our next guest, Kimberly Hayden. Good morning, Ms. Hayden.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you. I'm Kimberly Hayden. I'm an attorney practicing in Vermont, in Burlington. I've been an attorney in the energy sector for more than 30 years. I'm a mother, soon to be grandmother. I'm here as a private citizen, and very happy that you have welcomed me to give you some of my comments on the clean heat standard. I'm going to share my screen because I have a slide deck, which I will share with Judith, my assistant Maureen, who is also on the screen, will share after the presentation today.
Ms. Hayden, can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Just so we'll know what roles maybe it's in your testimony, fine, just let me know and we'll go ahead and just hear it. I didn't know if you participated, for instance, in the Vermont Climate Council or any of the particular subgroups or anything like that.
I did not. I offered to. I actually applied to. I did not participate. I was a little disappointed, but that's okay. I think at this point I'm the only energy lawyer in the state that's recognized by Best Lawyers. I have a strong and deep knowledge of the industry, particularly in Vermont. And of Vermont law, and in fact, worked on the team that negotiated the last Hydropower contract and got that approved. I understand the mechanics of that contract, and since that time, which was 2010, a lot of things have changed. And so I do appreciate some of the comments that Ms. Dow made about that resource, which is expanding and it does create a concern. It's kind of the second part of my presentation today, or my comments will be the intersection of the electric sector and the thermal or heating sector, and why we need to be very cautious about how this bill is structured and make sure that you have some guardrails for that are tied to the Paris Agreement and the foundational principles of that agreement to assure that we are not increasing emissions through these clean heat measures and credits that would be created under this bill. So if I might, I'll start with my presentation.
Yes, thanks.
So the Global Warming Solutions Act expressly requires the greenhouse gas reduction mitigation measures implemented by any policy enacted to achieve the reductions required by the Global Warming Solutions Act be consistent with the Paris Agreement. And on the screen, that is 10 VSA Section 578. So there is a direct connection and acknowledgement of the Paris Agreement, which is absolutely critical. And thankfully, the legislature incorporated that acknowledgement that what we're doing with our greenhouse gas emissions policies stem from the international commitments that we as the United States and other countries have committed to undertake. The Paris Agreement, and I think there's been a lot of confusion around terms that are used like double counting, additionality, are they required? Verifiability, environmental integrity. Where do these terms come from? What do they mean? They all stem from the initial 1994 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the UNFCCC is the parent treaty for the Paris Agreement, which was adopted by the nations by the convention in 2015. It's also the parent treaty of the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. And the ultimate objective of all three treaties is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere and to reduce them, particularly under the Paris Agreement. Now, the clean heat standard allows two types of measures. One would be the biofuels pathway, which would displace fossil fuels with biofuels. The other one is mitigation measures that could be credited, mitigation measures like weatherization, like air source heat pumps, that could be then credited as through an accounting mechanism as reducing greenhouse gases. And the Paris Agreement, like the Kyoto Protocol, allows for mitigation measures to be implemented, but there are specific guardrails or preconditions. And Articles 6.2 and Articles 4.13 of the Paris Agreement are very clear on what those preconditions are. Under 4.13, parties shall promote environmental integrity, transparency, accuracy, completeness, comparability, and consistency, and ensure the avoidance of double counting. The avoidance of double counting is also expressly required by Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. And Article 6.4 is clear that climate mitigation mechanisms must deliver an overall mitigation in global emissions. Double counting, I've watched some of the testimony. I've been away on personal matters, so I haven't been able to watch all of it, but there's a lot of discussion about double counting, and I agree with Mr. McNamara from the Agency of Natural Resources that this bill would allow double counting, which is prohibited by the Paris Agreement. Under the United Nations Framework Convention, double counting of emissions reduction occurs when a single greenhouse gas emission reduction is accounted more than once towards attaining a mitigation pledge. And that's a definition that is provided by the Stockholm Environmental Institute. And by the way, these slides that I'm running through now, we will provide to the committee following my testimony today. But I've got this citation for these references in my slide deck.
And it'd be great that you're sending your slides. Senator Campion.
Would you please go back to your double counting slide, please? So I want to handle this issue right now. So I've heard that this is not accurate. I've heard it is accurate. I don't know. I'd like to, Mr. Chair, just get, if we may, sort of settle this a little bit. Is it possible for Mr. Duval to say something on this, or would you prefer?
I think if we,
I would actually, as the witness right now, my preference would be that I could walk through and through my analysis of what double accounting or what double counting means under the Paris Agreement. And right. I understand.
I just want to make sure we get, I'm not, this has been somewhat debunked by our ledge counsel, as I recall. So fine, if that's everyone's preference. I just worry that just looking for the accurate stuff here. Thank you.
Well, and I see tier 3 on this slide, so I think that's
Okay.
gets right to the heart of whether the opportunity to quote unquote double count or not. So
Okay.
please continue. Thanks, and we'll try to make sure we get to something definitive. And so
Thank you.
Thanks for your helping us do that.
Thank you. So the provision of the bill that Mr. McNamara referenced, and it's on the slide that you see right now, it's 30 VSA section 8124, which creates these tradable clean heat credits. Again, we're not talking about biofuels. These are credits that would be associated with mitigation measures like weatherization and heat pumps, et cetera. And then they would be allowed to be traded as essentially commodities or offsets, carbon offsets, and accounted for as if they were reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And the provision in the bill that I've highlighted in black is the troublesome part. So section 8124G provides that all eligible clean heat measures that are delivered in Vermont shall be eligible for clean heat credits and may be retired and counted towards an obligated party's emission reduction obligations, regardless of who creates or delivers them, regardless of whether their creation or delivery was required by other state policies and programs. This includes emissions reductions resulting from state energy efficiency programs, low income weatherization programs, which we heard about earlier this morning. And if there's a separate bill that would be funding $80 million worth of additional low income weatherization. And the Renewable Energy Standard 3 program that the utilities are required to comply with, which has a certain performance standard for reducing thermal and transportation emissions. Now, the reason so what this essentially allows is a triple counting of the greenhouse gas reduction claims. Actions that are taken pursuant to Res Tier 3, that is the separate actions of the utilities, the investments that they make towards that pledge, and that it's not just a pledge, it's a mandate that they perform and reduce their emissions and account for them in the compliance filings that they make with the PUC. The second, accounting for the same efforts could be through the weatherization pledges and programs like the low-income weatherization program that was discussed this morning, and then the clean heat standard. The way this would work and the reason that there's a double counting prohibition in the Paris Agreement is that it is a backstop to make sure that we have additionality in the measures that we're taking, that there is additionality in measures so that we are in fact reducing greenhouse gas emissions incrementally. We're not taking credit for something that's going to be done anyway. And that's been talked about as, the but-for test under the Kyoto Protocol, but it's a very important test because unless we're actually taking additional measures to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, then it's all just, essentially a Ponzi scheme, a trading of credits, and it's very, very dangerous and I think problematic for Vermont. And again, I just mentioned that the additionality was codified by the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention, or COP. It was COP 21 it was an earlier COP that was part of the Kyoto Protocol, but the Kyoto Protocol, Article 12, Paragraph 5C, expressly tells us what additionality means. It means that energy resources must result in reductions in emissions that are additional to any that would occur in the absence of the project. And here, for example, where we have a low-income weatherization program that is investing $80 million in weatherization measures, and then taking that same measure under the clean heat standard, creating a credit from it and giving it to the obligated parties, i.e. the fuel dealers in Vermont Gas, and saying, we're going to now give you credit for that reduction in greenhouse gases, which came from a separate program. That's double counting. That does not reflect any additionality. It would not be permitted under the Green E standard, which is the voluntary certification entity for greenhouse gas reductions that, you know, most of the very large corporations engage in to meet their sustainability obligations. It does not pass muster under the Kyoto Protocol, and it would not pass muster under the Paris Agreement. Additionality is implicitly required by Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, requirement that climate mitigation mechanisms must deliver an overall mitigation in global emissions. And I've been asked this question by others, well, where is that language additionality in the Paris Agreement? The Conference of the Parties, the COP21 2015, that passed and adopted the Paris Agreement explicitly recommends in their finding 37 that any mitigation measures mechanisms established pursuant to Article 6.4 must also establish that they reduce emissions, that they achieve reductions in emissions that are additional to any that would otherwise occur. And so we have this very explicit connection under the Global Warming Solutions Act to the Paris Agreement, and through the Paris Agreement and COP21 and the recommendations of the Conference of the Parties, that there be additionality in measures, mitigation measures, in this case, carbon offsets, clean heat credits, which are carbon offsets, that they actually reduce, that they are additional in terms of reducing emissions. I think I've already, this slide speaks to the precondition of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which again, the Paris Agreement references in the earlier slides that I referred to under Articles 4 and 6. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has adopted guidelines that require additionality, and they have a demonstration tool for additionality. Again, recommendation 37 of COP21 is very clear that additionality is a precondition for mitigation measures like in this case, the proposed clean heat standards, the clean heat credits.
What is it? How did people used to say additionality before they invented that word? What is additionality?
I think of it as I'm not an economist, but additionality means that you're taking an action that creates an additional or incremental change. So weatherization, the $80 million in weatherization that will be spent for low income is wonderful. But that it would, if we give credit to obligated parties for those measures, that means that additional measures or incremental weatherization measures or conservation measures will not be undertaken, or that additional heat pumps will not be put in place. And that's so additionality is, we always look at in economics, what is the marginal or incremental change that we're talking about? That's the entirety of the Paris Agreement, where we are supposed to be reducing our emissions and taking actions to create additional reductions in emissions. That means displacing fossil fuels and not masking them over with the clean heat credit or a carbon offset credit from another action that would have been taken anyway.
Mr. Chair, one of the principles that this committee said we agreed to was we weren't going to allow this bill to allow people to sell the same horse twice. And we're committed to that. Are you giving us language on how to define and make sure that the same horse isn't being sold twice? Is that what you're doing in your testimony?
I am, and I would go back to the slide, which I have in front of you now, which is section 8124G of the bill. I would strike what I have highlighted in black from that and replace it with the express language of the Paris Agreement.
But, Mr. Chair, we are seeking to empower perhaps the PUC or somebody else to make sure that the same a horse doesn't get sold twice. And the witness is giving us, I believe, very specific methods and ways and language to see that no one sells the same horse twice. Is that what we're seeing here now?
Well, I think that seems like, we'll ask the witness, but it seems like a fair characterization, and the suggestion up here, striking the language in black, I think is her suggestion for how that might be achieved. Is that right, Christine?
Thank you, and I appreciate the question. I think that it's a very important question. It's very meaningful. California also has a Global Warming Solutions Act, and they have it's really a cap and trade program that they use, but the County of San Diego adopted a clean heat plan. I don't know if it was 2019, but it was litigated for quite a few years. In 2020, that plan was struck down because it failed to have additionality. The court looked at the language of the legislation, which imported language from the Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol. It required additionality, precluded double counting, and that clean heat plan for the County of San Diego was struck down. And I'm happy to provide that case along with, it was Clean Doors Properties. I don't have it at the top, I don't have it right now, but I certainly have that case. It is, to my knowledge, the only case that has where a court has struck down a climate action plan because it failed to have additionality. But it's very important precedent. The court explained what additionality means and why it's an important concept and precondition when we're talking about taking actions that reduce emissions.
Yeah, if you could send a link to that case, that would be great. When was that decision issued? What year?
That was in 2020.
Okay, thank you. I'm a little mindful of the clock, so if we could go, I think I'm glad we took the detour to dig into that a little bit, but I want to make sure we get all the way through your presentation, please.
Thank you. The second part of my presentation is very much tied to the first part, and that is that we have to be very vigilant not to allow carbon loopholes in any standard that we implement in Vermont to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I know you've heard about this previously. It's not part of this bill to address the electric sector and the renewable energy standard, but I've heard testimony that this bill is a winner because it's based on the renewable energy standard construct. And that's actually, in my mind, that is a losing argument. The renewable energy standard allows Vermont utilities to take unbundled attributes from Hydro-Quebec and other resources, meaning they're called, conventionally they're called renewable energy credits, but in Vermont, under the statute, Hydro-Quebec credits are not referred to as RECs because they are not recognized as a REC in any other jurisdiction. They're attributes associated with the electricity. And in Vermont, our utilities are allowed to procure attributes from Hydro-Quebec and then net them against their electricity purchases. And the reason this is problematic, I'll show you in the next several slides. It creates a loophole that allows the utilities to increase their fossil fuel purchases. In 2019, then this is a slide from Green Mountain Power's renewable energy standard compliance spreadsheet from 2020. They every year they report to the PUC. They use these spreadsheets format that the PUC has required. And in August of each year, they report on the prior year's performance. You can see that in line 18 is the total megawatt hours of load of electricity consumed by Green Mountain Power's customers. That was about 4.3 million megawatt hours in 2019. Of that, there were various different types of fuel resources for the electricity. 416,000 megawatt hours came from, at that time, the ISO New England system mix.
And
1 year later, slide 12 shows us that Green Mountain Power doubled that, more than doubled that to almost to over 900,000 megawatt hours from the ISO New England system mix. The ISO New England system mix is largely natural gas. It is largely fossil fuel. That is not accounted for in terms of the electricity that greenhouse gas emissions or fossil fuel component that Green Mountain Power reports, because they are taking credit through the offsets from the RECs that they claim associated with Hydro-Quebec system mix. And if I go back to the 2021 slide, you can see in line 6, electricity delivered, actual megawatt hours delivered from Hydro-Quebec was 1 million megawatt hours. 2.8 million megawatt hours of RECs in the next column over were delivered to Vermont. Those are the unbundled attributes that I'm talking about that are then netted against other fossil fuels in the electricity that Vermonters are actually consumed. The problem with that accounting scheme is that those Hydro-Quebec unbundled attributes do nothing. There's no additionality in them because many of them come from existing very old power plants that have been running forever. So there's no additionality. We're not doing anything to reduce the emissions. Those plants would be running no matter what. So there's no REC, there's no offset that would meet an additionality requirement under the Paris Agreement with this scheme that we're using. And the reason this is dangerous is because with the clean heat standard, if we electrify the thermal grid with air source heat pumps, et cetera, relying on as an electric sector that is itself very dirty, we will exacerbate our emissions. We will increase emissions. I just quickly want to point out that Green Mountain Power also claimed credit for having a 100% carbon-free portfolio in 2021 in their filing. And if you look at line 10, they did that because they purchased unbundled so-called RECs, but really attributes from nuclear power. And again, this is Seabrook and Millstone. Those plants are operating. They have been operating. There's no additionality. Those carbon offsets are meaningless. And the reason I just want to emphasize these points is that accounting matters. And I think it was Darren Springer the other day that said, we don't need to get too mired down in accounting under the Paris Agreement, under the foundational principles of the Paris Agreement. Accounting is everything. Emissions reductions that are required under the Paris Agreement are required to be incremental. We're supposed to be reducing emissions. And so how we account for that means everything. Thank you.
Okay, I have a quick question so that I should know this, but I don't. The New England system mix, if it were being evaluated under the criteria in Vermont for renewable content, what would it score? Like what percent of that system mix meets our renewable energy requirement?
I can look that up. I mean, there's a very small slice that's in fact solar and wind. There's an expectation that wind will increase, but I mean, they're under 10%. I would say more in the nature of 2% for solar. Hydropower. So Vermont defines large scale hydro as renewable. No other New England state or state in the country that I'm aware of would define large scale and old vintage hydro as renewable. So, and that's a problem because we're working in these markets that don't recognize resources the way Vermont does. So using the conventional definition of what is renewable, I would say that most of the ISO New England system mix is not renewable. In fact, the portion of natural gas has ballooned over the last decade. And I'm happy to provide links to the ISO New England annual energy outlook. They have that's produced by ISO New England every year. And they provide that information in a slide deck that's very understandable. That slide deck every year, they have a graphic that shows the New England states and their RPSs. Vermont, and meaning renewable portfolio standards and what their goals and mandates are. Vermont is never on the graph other than up on the side with a footnote that says Vermont is unique in recognizing large scale hydro and resources of any vintage. Almost every other New England state requires that there be like a 15-year cutoff for resources, meaning we have to have new resources added, new renewable resources added to the mix if we're going to incrementally reduce our emissions and displace fossil fuels.
Okay, and one last quick question for me. So if somehow, this isn't gonna happen, but a large hydro dam were developed, I don't know, the Connecticut River, and so it would qualify as new and additional, how long would it be appropriate to call that asset renewable?
What the Green E standard and what, I mean, many states, the New England states, I looked at their kind of vintage periods for new renewable, and I would say most are around 15 years. That is what Green E uses for their metric for the and this is again the voluntary market, but is probably the most abundant, active carbon offset market in the world. So I would say 15 years would be appropriate. You know, at this juncture, that would be an appropriate metric because we are going off the cliff with our emissions and global warming. Even a shorter vintage may be appropriate. I mean, we need to start taking action and putting in clean resources on the electric sector immediately, and we're not doing that. We have stalled out completely.
And does replacing the turbines, upgrading the equipment at an older facility, something more than 15 years old, does that renew sort of its legitimate claim of renewability, or how do I mean, because they do get reconfigured over time, or
I would call that maybe a maintenance or an efficiency measure. I know McNeil had additional scrubbers put in at some point in the last decade or so. And we do see, you know, of course, these hydro units can install, they can reconfigure their turbines, rewind their generators, do different things that can make them more efficient. That's helpful, but that's a small incremental add. Whereas when you install a completely new renewable resource, that provides a lot more megawatt hours of displacement than just a small incremental efficiency through a retrofit.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you very much for your very well informed and detailed analysis. And if we have your slide deck so that we can look at it more carefully after we're finished our committee work today. So thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, I'd like to go to our next guest, Ms. Schulker. And there she is on the screen. And hello. Good morning. Good to see you again. Long time no see from the Finance Committee. And so I'm timekeeper, and sometimes I do better at it than others. Can you complete your testimony between now and 10 o'clock, which is 15 minutes?
Well, I can talk pretty fast.
Okay. We'll listen pretty fast. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Small words.
So I do have a couple of slides I'd like to put up if I can share my screen, which is disabled at the moment.
Should be.
Great. Yeah, now I'm seeing. Are you able to see that? I'm not sure that worked.
Yeah, we can, thank you.
Okay, maybe you're seeing all the rest of the noise in my on my screen, but I'm just going to leave it that for the moment in the interest of time. So thank you so much for letting me address this committee today. And I want to thank you also for your service to the state of Vermont. And I appreciate that this is a really complicated issue and that you've been putting a lot of time and energy, and so have people out in the community. It's been a lot of interest. Sorry?
Is there any way you can make that slide bigger? It's not in slideshow mode yet. There we go. That's
Okay.
great.
Okay, thanks. So, and I appreciate that this has been a sticky issue. And one of the reasons that it's so sticky is that when we're really honest with ourselves, there just simply aren't any perfect, clean, silver bullet solutions to any of our energy problems that we're faced with, including heating and also every other form of energy that we use. And that's why I think that, you know, we have to listen to what Judy and Beverly Little Thunder have said about the difference between wants and needs, and the need to focus in particular on reducing our demand for energy, because there is no alternative fuel source that's just going to plug in and be truly clean. The word clean has sort of been rendered meaningless in discussions about energy anymore, because when we look at all the different choices that we're faced with, be it big hydro or biofuels or natural gas or fossil fuel oil or any of the options that we have, they are all problematic, which is why we need to focus. And in my opinion, this bill needs to get put on the back burner, and we need to start evaluating ways that we can cut back on our demand for energy overall in a holistic perspective, not sector by sector with transportation separate from heating and so on. I understand that that is in some ways a useful approach, but without some cross fertilization across these different sectors and thinking in a much more holistic way about how we can reduce emissions. So what I have a background in 18 years now working as co-director of Biofuel Watch, and our work has mostly been looking at the impacts of large-scale bioenergy. And I have to say that, I start to have this view of us as we are approaching the climate crisis, where the world is slowly being converted into industrial monocultures of soy and corn for biofuels, and the forests are being cleared and burned for electricity, and the whole planet is just sort of slowly eating itself for energy, because that is literally what is happening on the big picture. And we work internationally, nationally, and at the community level for all these years, and have seen how this industries in the biofuel sector have just been a juggernaut that is really alarming. So this slide that I wanted to start out with is land use intensity for energy production. And it's from a study that was published in Science some years ago. And I want to point out the top 3 long bars. This is the land use per unit of energy derived. The top one is biodiesel from soy, which is hugely land intensive. Electricity from biomass is the second most lengthy purple bar at the top. And ethanol from cellulose, which does not exist commercially, is the third. The next one down is ethanol from corn. So ethanol from corn, electricity from biomass, and biodiesel from soy are the most land intensive forms of energy that we have at our disposal. Down at the bottom, when you see purple bars heading the other way, efficiency gains and in electricity and liquid fuels. Those are the so-called negative land use forms of energy. So the point here just being that it takes a lot of land to make bioenergy. I'll talk about this slide in just a moment. I'm just putting there as a reminder. The most likely fuels that we would see being used, I don't see it really specified in the language of the Clean Heat Standard, but it's going to be soy, biodiesel, and wood heat, and also renewable natural gas, which is kind of circling back into the world of biofuels, and biogas. Those are the most likely fuels that we're going to see. And in particular, I'm going to start talking about the soy biodiesel. Soy biodiesel or biodiesel in general, is largely produced from soy, almost the vast majority. So you will hear from industry, as you did from the Clean Fuels Alliance, which was known as the National Biodiesel Board up until recently, and represents the soy growers and promoters of the United States, basically. And they're in the business of selling soybeans. So they will tell you that most often you will see them refer to things like used cooking oil. Used cooking oil is a tiny, tiny fraction and increasingly under demand for uses, including for biodiesel. Used cooking oil contributes a tiny fraction to overall biodiesel production. The vast majority is produced from soybean oil. So let's talk more about soy. This is vegetable oil production worldwide that you see on the left. And you can see between 1961 and 2014, vast expansion of vegetable oil production. And this is not only for biodiesel, but also for other uses. Biodiesel has been a major factor, but it's not the only one. And soy expansion is the green wedge that you see, and above that is palm oil, the blue wedge. The two largest parts of this expansion are soybean oil and palm oil. On the right, you see vegetable oil price tracking. So what's important about vegetable oils is that all of these are largely interchangeable in their uses. So they can, so if you increase demand for one kind of vegetable oil, you will see this ricochet through the markets, because the existing demand will then go somewhere else and find something else. So if we expand our demand for soybean oil, someone else who is already using vegetable oil or wants to use vegetable oil will find a different kind of vegetable oil. And usually what that ends up happening is the expansion of palm oil, which is the cheapest and also terribly destructive to the climate because of peatland fires and deforestation in Indonesia and Malaysia and human rights abuses and so on. So because of the interconnection of all these markets, any increased demand for vegetable oil ends up filtering back into an expanded demand for palm oil. The world of biofuels has been struggling for quite some time with this issue of indirect land use change, which is, essentially this. Yeah.
Quick question. So soybean oil, what portion of that is used for food?
Well, a lot of soybean expansion has occurred as a result of the livestock industry and the heightened demand for meat. And then the biodiesel demand is on top of that. If I can just go on, I can, get you specific figures after. I don't have that at the top of my hat right now. But one thing that is extremely alarming right at the moment is that we are seeing the aviation industry and lots of other industries getting very excited about what's called hydrotreated vegetable oil fuels, which are drop-in diesel fuels made from vegetable oils. And so you can use these for aviation, which is a huge, huge market. And we're seeing right now, the Energy Information Administration has reported that if all of the plans come to fruition for hydrotreated vegetable oil fuels, this would increase fivefold by 2024 to running all those facilities at full capacity would create an additional 17 million metric tons of additional demand for oils and fats. And this is basically impossible with the surface of the earth. And it's recognized that this cannot be met. But the point is that there's tremendous competition for vegetable oil fuels underway. We're also seeing that in the context of the crisis with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that this is having ricochet effects through the whole food production system because of the important role that both Ukraine and Russia have played in providing not only grains and food staples, but also energy that goes into fertilizer production. So there's both a huge bite taken out of the production and distribution of some of the basic commodity food crops and grains, and also from the energy and the fertilizer markets. And so, as the UN Secretary General recently stated, we are facing a hurricane of hunger and a meltdown of the global food system as a result of not only the invasion of Ukraine, but the escalating impacts of climate change, which are also reducing yields and impacting farming globally because of the droughts and floods and so on. So I'm going to switch. I just wanted to point out that I submitted quite detailed comments in writing to this committee yesterday. And so, anything that comes up in my very hasty presentation here, maybe in the written comments. And I do hope you will take a look at them, since I spent all of this past weekend rather than working in my garden. So I want to touch on wood burning as well, because I'm aware that there's a huge push for, quote, advanced wood heat to be part of the clean heat standard. So we have worked for many years on the issues of large scale wood bioenergy, in particular the export of wood pellets from the Southeast to the UK. We have staff in Europe who have been focused on that for quite some time. And in fact, we were at the forefront of highlighting the impacts of this on forests and also on human health. So wood burning is, it's very strange to watch the conversations around climate change happening, because on the one hand, we see a lot of discussion about the important role of forests and the land sector in sequestering carbon. And on the other hand, we see a huge amount of conversation about how we can burn more wood and clear land for expanded agriculture for bioenergy crops and other. And those two things are simply incompatible. We either have to allow our forests to grow and do the work that they can do to sequester carbon, or we can cut them and burn them. But if you have incentives to cut and burn, and you're incentivizing the burning of wood through subsidies, supports, that will happen and that will escalate. And that is exactly what is happening, as we see state after state, country after country, converting coal plants to burn wood, advocating for burning wood for energy and also for heat. Here in the state of Vermont, there may be some small, reasonable use of wood heat, but if we don't have really solid protections for our forests in place, they will be logged and they will be degraded, and in some cases they will be clear cut in order to provide that wood heat. The air pollution impacts from wood heat are well understood at this point. Any place that is a place where a lot of people are living in concentration is not going to be appropriate for wood heat. There may be some places in more rural locations, and there are things that can be done to really improve the way that wood heat is done in the state in a very limited fashion, in concordance with serious forest protections. And I know there are several bills that are being considered in the legislature this year to adopt the Vermont conservation goals and 30 by 30 protections. So we can't at the same time incentivize the use of wood as we are working to protect our forests, or we're going to end up in trouble. So I think that one of the key things with the wood burning is that, having worked on this for many years, the accounting, as prior testimony said, accounting is everything. And wood has continued to be accounted as zero emissions, as carbon neutral, which is so far from reality. And there's a burgeoning mountain of literature about how far from reality that is. But industry has been very effective in controlling the narrative there and controlling the policy directions on how accounting for wood burning. In my view, what is really essential is that we have honesty. I mean, there's, as I said, there are no silver bullets. They all have problems. Honest accounting is what we need to do in order to actually be effective. And I mean, I was really a bit surprised to see, for example, the National Biodiesel Board, AKA Clean Fuels Alliance, who provided testimony to you they actually argued that it is more cost effective to switch to burning soybeans than it is to adopt efficiency and try to reduce demand. That's pretty bold. That's a bold statement, and I think it is absolutely wrong, and it is a reflection of their interest in selling soybeans. So information comes to us, and it comes to us from different sources, and those sources have different interests. They have vested interests in different aspects of this bill, and I understand how difficult it is to sort through it all. I've been at this for a lot of years, and it gets very frustrating. I think, one of the concerns that I have is that Vermont Gas has been playing a critical role in developing this clean heat standard. Renewable natural gas and landfill gas have become a big player in the world of biofuels. This happened in part because of the failure of producing cellulosic ethanol and advanced biofuels, which have largely failed. Corn ethanol is still the king when it comes to liquid biofuels, along with biodiesel. And so what the EPA did was they legislatively decided that landfill gas, under some circumstances, could be and biogas could qualify for the subsidies and incentives that were in place under the renewable fuel standard for cellulosic ethanol. So I think that overall, this bill needs to get put on the back burner. There are a lot of things that we can do to address the heating sector problems that we have with emissions. I think that we need to listen to the science. We need to be honest. We need to do true accounting. And then we need to face up to the fact that the only real solution for our problems is to really focus on reducing demand, as several other people have said. And there are things we can do. I understand weatherization is already on the table, and I'm really happy to hear that. I hope that goes as far as it possibly can. But there are other things that can be done, including programmable thermostats, education programs for people to learn how to cut back on their heating use, trading out really inefficient wood stoves in places where wood burning might be appropriate. The EPA has recently upped the standards for efficiency on those wood stoves, and they're much cleaner. We can do some studying and learning from people who have lived off grid and managed to do without so much energy. There's a lot to be learned, a lot of lessons to be learned from those people. Some kind of a study group on how those people have figured things out for themselves would be very informative, I think. Developing some community processes so that people living in one area can get together and talk about how they can communally find ways that work where they are located is another option. Building codes, any new buildings especially should be, it should not be the case that if you're filthy rich, you can come in and build a massive big mansion and heat it day, night, 24 hours a day. That has to be de-incentivized, if you will, or regulated, whatever term you want to use. But creating incentives for people to cut back on their use is possible and could take us a long way. And again, I think having a really holistic approach to how we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions that does not trade off the land area and land sector and forests is something that we can do with in a thoughtful manner. So again, put this bill on the back burner and let's take a different approach.
So thank you very much for your testimony, your closing remarks with suggestions for things to emphasize or consider. Are they included in your the document you sent to us yesterday?
No, I don't think so. I actually don't remember, but I'm happy to send you those.
Okay, well, that would be great, because we're a little bit drinking from the fire hose mode, and that's the nature of towards the end of a session. But it's great when we have your presentation in writing, because after hours, we can read through and catch back up and reconsider. So thank you as always for your informed testimony. And with that, I'd like to turn to our next guest this morning, Mr. Duval, Jared Duval. If you could join us at the table, that'd be great.
Thank you, Chair Bray. Members of the committee, good to be with you again.
So sorry to interrupt. Committee, we are going to go to 10:30 and then take a very short break because we have Mr. O'Grady and others coming in on the water bill. So apologize that we're filling our break time, but we need to hear all the testimony. So thank you.
For the record, my name is Jared Duval. I am with you today in my role as a member of the Vermont Climate Council, and I'm testifying on behalf of an informal working group of a broad collection of participants who, while they represent diverse perspectives and interests, all share a commitment to Vermont meeting our Global Warming Solutions Act requirements and seeing the Vermont Climate Action Plan succeed. This working group has included multiple Climate Council members, multiple environmental organizations, multiple members of the Clean Heat Design Working Group and design paper. Out of our careful work together, I'd like to offer a number of consensus suggestions that we think can help clarify and improve some important parts of the bill, building on many of the primary suggestions that Chair Brigman made when he first introduced H715 to this committee. And also, while I do not claim to speak for or represent any of the witnesses who have testified immediately before me, a number of the language change recommendations that I will share are intended to address some of.
I'm sorry, just to interrupt. Are we looking at this for related to Mr. Duval, or is this something?
Yes, so
Okay.
the suggestions that he has brought forward
Okay.
based on those working group discussions
Are in this?
are edited right into
Thank
the
you.
document, and they appear in red. So I think we're going to do a walkthrough on those, as well as hear about more than just the walk.
Excuse me, red highlight or red print?
red
Print.
The first one appears on page 10, but
Yeah, excuse me, you're gonna have to identify each because I'm colorblind.
I will, okay. Understood, happy to.
You're off to a great start.
So just to finish the introduction, a number of the language change recommendations that I will share are intended to address some of the concerns that have been discussed today and in previous testimony throughout over the last week. So the first place I would like to start is in section 8123 F2. This is on page 10, starting on line 3. The suggestion is to change the word hired to the word contracted, simply because it is a more accurate and appropriate term for what the commission will be doing.
Yeah.
Okay, now where does that start?
That's on
I'm on
Page
page
10.
10. What line?
Yeah, 3.
And it extends to when?
that's it.
Oh, that's
It's-
the only
it's
thing.
changing one word on line 3 from hired to contracted
Oh, okay.
as a more accurate and appropriate term. The other more consequential suggestion appears on line 5, 2 lines below. And this is meant to address concerns that have been raised about, while I think many people understand that the default delivery agent will have to be a market participant by definition if they are providing clean heat measures. There is concern, and we want to ensure that an obligated party, a fossil fuel seller, could not be that default delivery agent. So the recommendation is to add at the end of that line, or I'll just read the sentence in full as we suggest that it would appear on lines 4 and 5. The entity selected as the default delivery agent may also be a market participant, but shall not be an obligated party. So
I have a question about that one. So we've talked about not having those who are in the business of selling in a fuel to the system be the obligated party. Shall not be the default delivery agent. So this addresses a fuel dealer, for instance. But we also know there's a carbon footprint related to electricity. And so there are distribution utilities that are also potentially could have that same, I don't know, I probably want to call it conflict of interest, but conflicting interests in their own, in the way their business operates. Did your group consider the notion of also including, expanding the exclusion to include electric distribution utilities?
The group did not come to suggested language there, but that overall concept is agreed to and by the group. We think that would be fine to also exclude electric distribution utilities from eligibility to serve as the default delivery agent.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Senator McDowell.
If the electric utility is providing electricity from the sun, it's not dealing with carbon. So wouldn't who's ever selling carbon to the electric distribution, selling carbon-based electricity to the electric distributor, wouldn't they come under jurisdiction when they were generating that electricity?
So it's, well, Mr. DeVos can speak for the group, but we're talking about who can be a default delivery agent.
Okay.
Just that.
Okay.
entity. So
Okay.
that
Thank
power
you.
would be allowed in, but not, they would be.
I was questioning on the wrong plane. Okay.
So the next suggestion is in section 8124B. This is on page 13, starting on line 5. And the additional text we would like to suggest is for the purpose of providing clarity of how clean heat credits shall be calculated in an instance in which the clean heat measure is the installation of equipment versus the providing of a fuel. So just to provide 2 quick examples. One way that a clean heat credit measure could be calculated is a lower carbon fuel, say a biodiesel, replacing fuel oil. That's a pretty direct comparison of the emissions of one fuel versus the other, and they get compared against each other on a carbon intensity scale, the way that Corey and Wynn from the Oregon Clean Fuels Program described yesterday.
Right.
However, there are other clean heat measures where it is not the selling of a fuel, but it is the installation of a piece of equipment. So take, for instance, a heat pump water heater that is installed to fully replace a propane water heater. In that instance, we're not going to be able to track the fuel use of that water heater because it will be connected to a meter that has other loads on it. You know, how much electricity is the refrigerator using versus the heat pump water heater. And so the way that this has been dealt with in the past for efficiency, for tier 3 and those technical advisory groups, is they do studies to understand how much energy on average does that equipment installation use? How much does it reduce? And then there's a value that's calculated there. So this is just to be clear that in the instance of where you're comparing fossil fuel reduction to an equipment installation, that the way that it's, to just be clear about how that would work, starting on line 5, for clean heat measures that are installed, the value of the clean heat credits shall be the life cycle carbon dioxide equivalent CO2e emissions of the heating fuel whose use is avoided by the installation of the measure, minus the life cycle CO2e emissions of the energy that would be used instead. That final use of the word energy is important because we're often talking upfront about the use of fossil heating fuels. But often what will be replacing them, in the case of a heat pump water heater, let's stick with that example, is electricity. And so we want to be clear to use the inclusive term of energy, which would include electricity and fuels, you know, make sure that there is some initial guidance about how to approach the question of a piece of an installation versus a fuel. I'm happy to say more about that if it's helpful, but I'm also happy to move on to some specific suggestions in the lines below. So that paragraph ends with the phrase, eligible clean heat measures delivered to or installed in Vermont shall include, and then it has a list. Previously, it was 6 measures to include, and there were some suggested changes to that. One is, if you see on line 9, well, let me start on line 8. Originally, it said renewable natural gas and low emission advanced gases. There was not clarity about what low emission advanced gases meant, what the definition for it was, what it was meant to refer to. So the suggestion is just to change line 8, which is B3, from basically take out those words. So it just reads renewable natural gas. It does not then say and low emission advanced gases. What was primarily intended by that phrase low emission advanced gases is green hydrogen. So that is added as a number 4
Right.
below that for increased clarity. And then finally, on line 12, which would now move to number 6, the suggestion is to change that wording from advanced wood heating appliances and systems to advanced wood heating. Because the rationale for that, I think, relates to actually some of the testimony that you heard earlier, that the emissions reduction related to an advanced wood heat measure partially relates to the equipment installation, but it also depends on the type of wood that is used in that equipment. So for instance, there are lower life cycle emissions. I mean, I haven't seen the numbers on this, but this is almost certainly true if you just think about the production methods. Almost certainly lower life cycle carbon dioxide emissions from wood pellets produced at Vermont Wood Pellet in Clarendon, Vermont, for instance, versus pellets that are shipped in by rail car from the Pacific Northwest or brought in by truck from the Southeast. And so this is not to tie the hands of the PUC in terms of how they should assess the life cycle value of advanced wood heating clean heat measures. So they have the ability to look at both potential reductions from an equipment installation or from the use of fuel, one or the other, or in some combination. That's a question that will have to be resolved given the unique nature of wood heating. I would also note that this whole section begins, that list of numbered eligible measures begins with the phrase shall include. So it also leaves open the opportunity for the technical advisory group and the PUC to add to this list if there are new measures that are that are appropriate to qualify in terms of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions into the future. This is not meant to be a final list that can never change. So that is that. On to the next, which is on page 14. This is section 8124D. Let's start with line 3. The suggestion is, so let me read that, the line that precedes it. The schedule shall be based on transparent and accurate emissions accounting, adapting the Argonne National Laboratory GREET model. The suggestion is to add a comma, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, parentheses IPCC modeling, or an alternative of comparable analytical rigor to achieve the thermal sector greenhouse gas emissions reductions, ... The idea here is that Vermont shouldn't be reinventing the wheel on life cycle assessments. We should start with carefully produced, peer-reviewed, authoritative sources. Certainly the Argonne National Lab's GREET model is one of those, but that was primarily developed to assess the life cycle emissions of transportation fuels. And since we are focused on the thermal sector, there will need to be additional life cycle emissions accounting that has not yet occurred within the GREET model for some of the measures that would be used here. And so we think it helpful to identify other impeccable sources of rigorous life cycle modeling, of which the IPCC is one.
Tradable. So this isn't putting anything in conflict. In other words, it's not as though somebody's going to, you know what I'm saying? I mean, these 3 options aren't putting people in any kind of conflict going forward, like, you know, in terms of how things are measured.
That's right.
Okay.
So this
Because normally it would be 1, that we would be looking to, but in this case,
there's no one that can answer all of the questions that are
Okay.
going to need to be answered. And so
That's
the approach
perfect.
is
Okay.
to provide some options. And then there is still the flexibility for the technical advisory group to look at, as that sentence ends, or an alternative of comparable analytical
Okay.
rigor.
thank you.
So my understanding was that the Argonne National Laboratory Group model was initially established for transportation fuels. So it's being adapted to look at thermal fuels, but it's not exactly on point. So there's a desire to find standards that are more appropriate for this bill, and that this gives them the chance to find the best possible standard to apply.
So the next suggestion is just a couple of lines below that, line 6 on page 14. And this is really just following what is understood to be the intent, but a belts and suspenders clarification to make it exceedingly clear that the emissions reductions shall be based on, here line 6, the suggested additional language is accurate accounting of biogenic and geologic emissions. So Corey and Wynn spoke to this yesterday, that in order to be able to compare biofuels, which are create a biogenic source of emissions or part of the carbon cycle, with fossil fuels that are they're geologically based in terms of the emissions that they add, you need that common carbon intensity scale. And so we just want to be clear that the emissions accounting will include both biogenic and sources from geologic emissions.
Any questions on that one?
Yeah, I was lost there. I was lost there. No.
You mean like not finding the change, or
No,
what
I
does it mean? What's it mean?
I didn't know what the issue was that we were trying to deal with. The GREET measures weight, moving weights over distances. The next one is thermal is temperature over time periods. And this last one was what?
So this last one is on line 6. It's simply adding language that I think everybody understands to already be intended, just to make it explicitly clear that the emissions accounting would include accurate accounting of biogenic and geologic emissions.
So the amount of fossil fuels used in the generation of burnable stuff.
That would be the source of geologic emissions. The biofuels are a source of biogenic emissions. They're just different types. They're categorized as different types of emissions based on where they come from. Geologic, fuels that are geologically based, it's carbon formed from deposits millions of years old, whereas biophase fuels produce biogenic emissions that are part of a carbon cycle that
In which you are putting carbon into the production of these fuels, which use less carbon, but
may use less carbon.
if they
will
don't use less carbon, then some of our witnesses were on target. saying,
right. If they don't use less carbon, they
going
won't be
backwards
eligible.
instead of forwards. Okay, thank you.
So someone were asking me about this in the grocery store to do. You want to track the emissions, whether they come out of burning wood or soy, or whether they're fossil fuels pulled out of the ground. And we're just asking to be accurate.
Yes.
For both those trackers sources. Okay.
Yes.
If you're using more carbon than you're saving, then there's a place for you, but not at this table. Okay.
So the next suggestion is in section 8125 sub A3. This is page 16 on line 11. And this gets to, you'll remember that Chair Briglin had suggested that there be a clearer definition for sustainability, or expand on House Energy and Technologies work with relation to what does sustainability mean. We looked at some different sources and want to suggest language that is modeled off of what the EPA includes in a very broad understanding of sustainability, understandably and necessarily so. So the suggestion would be that sub 3 read this way: periodically assessing and reporting to the Commission on the sustainability of the production of clean heat measures. This is all new, by considering factors including greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration and storage, human health, land use changes, ecological and biodiversity impacts, groundwater and surface water impacts, air, water, and soil pollution, and increases in food costs. I think the other key change there, besides kind of sharing a number of key factors in the assessment of sustainability, is the addition at the very beginning of that line of periodically. This should not be a one and done assessment, because these factors are changing over time as the environment changes, as markets change. There can be different stressors kind of, so this should be a periodic assessment that is not static and done and forgotten. So next is on page 17 of the bill. This is staying in.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, may I ask quickly? So this said, so the reason this is going in, can you just give me the context
It's
of this section? Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the concern here was that the bill references the sustainability of the production of clean heat measures, but it doesn't say anything about what is meant by sustainability.
Okay.
So the goal
right.
was just to use a trusted, developed resource by the Environmental Protection Agency about some of the considerations that should go into that sustainability assessment.
Thank you.
So this is an answer to, what do you mean by sustainability?
Yes.
So this enables the system to craft, to look at what's going on and craft mid-course corrections if and when they are called for.
Yes.
I mean, it's the function that
That's the intention.
intention.
Got it. Thank you.
The next is on page 17, line 11. This is 8125B. This is about the technical advisory group. And I think whoever we have heard from, I think that there is a common understanding that the technical advisory group, it should not be about who is on it in terms of who they represent. It should be what experience and expertise is brought to bear so that this is a science and evidence-based process. This should be about transparency, about science, about peer review, and about technical and subject matter expertise. This should not be a competition between interest groups.
Right.
And so the goal here, so the proposed language is to say that members of the Clean Heat Standard Technical Advisory Group shall be appointed by the Commission, that is the same, and shall include the Department of Public Service and the Department of Environmental Conservation, that is the same, and parties who have or whose representatives have experience in one or more of the following areas: technical and analytical expertise in measuring life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, energy modeling and data analysis, expertise in clean heat measures and energy technologies, expertise in sustainability, non-greenhouse gas strategies designed to reduce and avoid impacts to the environment, expertise in delivery of heating fuels in cold climates, and expertise in climate change.
Don't plant unless we have Troy to do it all.
Okay.
Plant it in like the drier 80%.
Okay.
The
Because
technical advisory.
we have slug out, doesn't really matter.
Okay, so we'll work from the, drier end up. Cool, and then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that.
No problem.
Try to pick up where I left up: expertise in delivery of heating fuels in cold climates, and expertise in climate change mitigation policy and law. The commission shall accept and review motions to join the tag from interested parties who have or whose representatives have expertise in one or more of the areas listed in this subsection. So again, exactly as you just said, Senator McCormick, if I summarizing what I understood you to be saying accurately, this is about expertise in professional qualifications. That is designed to avoid kind of a competition between interest groups.
Although it does seem more likely to pick up different interest groups.
I think it's a fair point that whether it is a potentially an obligated party or an environmental organization, they could have members or staff who would have this expertise, and that would be appropriate, but they would be being selected for that experience and expertise, not to represent the interests of that organization.
I mean, I think that, to your point, that this has to be seems important, and that the political judgments about how the bill and the program develops, operates over time. That should be part of what the tag is. It ought to be delivering the science that then equips people on the political side of things to have an informed conversation. So I think pulling that kind of conflict out of the tag makes the tag a more credible and solid group, and it's useful to protect them from politics, let them do their job technically, and then use that where the bill becomes more political. Or when the operation of the program, when the legislatures are receiving reports from the PUC, that's where that kind of conversation seems like
So
well situated.
What's, I'm sure you've already mentioned this, but forgive me, what specific questions will this group be addressing? They're getting on to clean heat, the technical advisors.
Yep, so they will have to, for instance, assess what the life cycle emissions values should be from different clean heat measures, especially ones that haven't already been characterized. They will have to, very similar to what the energy efficiency technical advisory group or the tier 3 of the renewable energy standard technical advisory group does, assess the measures based on how long of a lifespan on average would this piece of equipment have? What's its efficiency rating? How much fuel or electricity would it use, and what would the emissions associated with that be? Those type of questions.
And a part of the mandate, if I'm right, part of the mandate to this whole activity is that equity issues be considered in all.
Yes, and there is a whole other equity advisory group.
Well, that's the
established
equity
as well.
advisor, but I'm wondering how, and maybe it can't be done, but I'd like to listen. How do we address equity in this? Or don't we?
This is a separate and distinct task from equity
Yes,
and
no, I
fairness.
guess it.
This is how you win the war. These are the people you hire to tell you what's going on and how you defeat.
No, I understand that.
Fossil
Mark.
fuels.
I understand that. I'm wondering if that doesn't contradict an element of our policy, which is that equity is.
Well,
part of
equity
everything.
is, you apply after it separately.
Well, no, I think that the law we have already passed says that we do not deal with equity separately. That whatever we do, we include equity.
Correct.
Now, I don't know how we include equity in
Well,
science. I don't know how we do
We'll
that.
probably discuss that when we discuss equity. Right now, we're, got an umpire
Well,
calling out at first
Mark,
base.
I know what we're doing. I
Okay.
don't have to have that explained to me what we're doing. The question I'm raising is, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing?
Well, right now, we're discussing
So let's
how to defeat and
Right.
reduce fossil fuels.
Without including equity.
No, not at this moment.
Right.
Yeah.
And
We'll discuss that when we get to equity.
I think I've expressed myself clearly. I'll leave it at that.
So I appreciate the question, and the science is not entirely without, it's not perfect. So don't say science itself is biased in terms of how you ask questions. So point taken, and for now, let's keep going till we get the last, and I think there's only one more, and then we'll.
That's right, and it goes, I think, directly to Senator McCormick's point about equity, because this is in section 8126, which is about the Clean Heat Standard Equity Advisory Group, and this is a suggestion to add a sub A6. So this will be on page 19, line 14. And the proposed addition for 6 is this: to providing recommendations to the commission on the challenges renters face in being equitably served by clean heat measures, and how to ensure that renters have equitable access to clean heat measures. This is particularly important because lower and moderate income Vermonters who own their home are in a different situation and have different level of agency and ability to change their fuel source or their heating system than lower moderate income Vermonters who rent and for whom those decisions are dependent on their landlord. There's often what is referred to as a split incentive issue, where even if a tenant wants to reduce their energy bill or change their fuel use, they have difficulty doing so because that decision is up to the landlord. So recognizing that that is a unique and particularly important issue from the perspective of equity, we add it to the list of what the Clean Heat Advisory Group should study and make recommendations on.
Right, so that was your last edit. Okay. So, thank you, everyone, for, Senator Campy.
Well, I do want to, just at some point, you might not want it now, Mr. Chair, but the double counting conversation continues to come up. And I
Yes.
just would love to,
Yeah,
to
and I-
maybe,
So, Mr. Duval, you want to say something about that? And then
I just want to say there were a number of things that came up in testimony earlier. I
Yeah,
think I
correct.
share the same goals and intentions of folks who presented. I deeply respect them and their work. I disagree with some of the assertions that were made and would be happy to either come back to address those or to provide a written response. There were a number of things that I don't agree with and think are problematic and not accurate.
So great, so I think I would ask, please, if you would craft a written response, and
That'd
we'll
be
also
great.
have you back. That way we'll have both ways of looking at it. Senator McCormick.
On additionality, I forget which play, but there is a scene in one of Shakespeare's plays in which a married couple are quarreling, and the woman explains to the man that he is not entitled to credit for having been faithful to her because he's old and fat and no woman would want him anyway. And I think that's sort of what.
that's mostly what the bill is about.
That's what we're questioning here, is the stuff that was gonna happen anyway. You know, do you really get credit for that? Or
Mr. Duval.
I'm not going to comment on that. I will just say briefly, the bill requires greenhouse gas emissions reductions that are real and additional in line with the Global Warming Solutions Act, period.
Additional is what we gotta look at.
Thank
All's
you.
well that ends well. Okay.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
So we are adjourned. So committee will take 10 minutes. So please be back in it